To begin, we must define what is a weakened castling position. A weakened castling position occurs when one of the castling pawns has moved, creating a breakpoint, a critical spot where pawn structures collide and lines open up. So in this position, where black has played g6, there is a critical breaking point on the h5 square. And what's very important, white hasn't castled yet. That's why the first world champion, Wilhelm Steinitz, instead of castling, chooses to push the pawn to h4, a strong move. Black continues their development with knight d7, while white, using their battering ram, knocks on the door of the castle with h5. The game proceeds with c5, and white exchanges pawns on g6, opening the h-file for the attack. Black cannot capture with the f-pawn because it is pinned, and they hesitate to take with the h-pawn, as it would completely open the file. Instead, they decide to capture with the knight. White continues by castling, both to secure the king and to bring the queen's rook into the attack. Black plays a6, trying to launch an attack on the queen side, but it is too slow. Steinitz has arrived first and continues his assault with knight g5, threatening h7. To defend, black moves their knight f6, but here's an essential lesson. For brilliant sacrifices to appear in our games, we must first play with good strategic foundations. After this well-executed plan, Steinitz sacrifices his knight on h7, 2 exclamation marks for this move. The idea is that after black captures, white will continue sacrificing material to completely open the h-file, while also bringing the queen into the attack with tempo gains. The king retreats to g8, and white's precise strategy to attack along the h-file culminates with rook h1, threatening checkmate on h7. In an attempt to escape, the rook moves to e8, but since the f-pawn is pinned by the bishop, the queen can capture the knight on g6. Black desperately plays queen f6, trying to bring pieces into the defense, but tactics still favor white, who responds with bishop takes f7, check. After the queen captures, the decisive blow is delivered along the h-file with the powerful move rook h8. The bishop cannot capture because it is pinned, so after the king is forced to take the rook, the queen on f7 is left hanging, and it is captured, leading to black's resignation. Now, how does the attacking idea change if the breakpoint is not on the h-file, but on the g-file? Let's analyze a slightly more complex position. As we can see, black has played h6, creating a breakpoint on g5 within their castling structure. And here is something crucial. White has not castled yet. This is why Alpha Zero, commanding the white pieces, plays the powerful move g4, lunging into the attack like a lion sinking its teeth into a gazelle's throat. If the knight captures the pawn, rook g1 follows, taking advantage of the already open g-file for the attack. Recognizing the danger, Stockfish, playing as black, declines the capture and instead responds with d takes c4. Despite this, white remains committed to the plan, playing rook g1 to directly support the breakthrough on g5. The knight moves to d5, but white wastes no time and breaks open the opponent's castling with g5, the central theme of this lesson. Black captures on f4, but remember, we play with strong strategy first, and then the tactics flow naturally. Instead of recapturing the knight, white sticks to the plan, continuing to expose the enemy king's position by capturing on h6, an excellent move. There is now a threat of rook takes g7, check, followed by king h8 and queen h7, checkmate. To stop this deadly sequence, black moves their knight to h5, covering g7. Alpha Zero captures and Stockfish recaptures. White has sacrificed an entire piece, but in return, black's castling is completely shattered. Just like in the previous example, castling on the opposite flank follows, securing the king while also bringing the queen's rook into the attack. Black plays queen a5, looking for counterplay against the king. However, White calmly responds with bishop takes c4, not just to recover a pawn, but to connect the rooks, reinforcing the attack. The queen moves to f5, but this lesson is about how to attack a weakened castling position, so AlphaZero refuses to trade queens and instead plays queen to e2, defending the knight. Stockfish pulls back the queen to h7, keeping it close to the defense of its king. But now, White's strategy along the g-file begins to bear fruit with the move rook g3, preparing to double rooks against the pinned knight on g7. The king moves to h8, but White remains relentless. The queen's rook joins the attack with rook g1, reinforcing the pressure. Now that the knight is no longer pinned, it jumps to f5, attacking the rook. However, AlphaZero calmly responds with the beautiful move queen to f1, an excellent idea. White sacrifices the rook on g3 because after black captures, the other rook recaptures, creating an unstoppable threat. The decisive blow comes with rook h3, winning the queen. At this point, AlphaZero has a decisive advantage and went on to win shortly after. We have already attacked along the h-file, and in this example, we struck along the g-file. Now let's move on to another instructive example. This time, we will break through the opponent's castling position via the f-file. White, led by the Russian Grandmaster Ruslan Ponomarev, plays the powerful move queen d4, threatening checkmate on g7. The defensive move bishop g6, aimed at blocking the g-file, is immediately refuted by knight h4, a powerful reply that simultaneously targets both the bishop and the rook on f5. Because of this, to defend against the mate threat, Viktor Korchnoi, playing with the black pieces, is forced to push the pawn to g6. This move, provoked by White, has now left all the dark squares around the king severely weakened, while also creating a critical breakpoint on f5. These two factors will play a decisive role in this position. With the queen's job on d4 complete, White retreats it to d2, clearing the square for the knight. Black develops the rook to e8, and the knight jumps to the mentioned square d4, attacking the rook on f5, which then moves to e5. And now, what move would you play with the white pieces? Exactly, f4, an excellent move. A tempo is gained by threatening on e5 while simultaneously activating the rook, which targets the breakpoint on f5. The rook moves to e4, but now the castling is completely shattered as White breaks through with f5, opening the f-file to unleash the attack against the king. Black steps out of the attack with king h8, and once again, for beautiful sacrifices and powerful attacks to appear in our games, we must first play with strong strategic foundations. Only then do tactical combinations naturally emerge. At this moment, White plays queen h6, sacrificing the knight on d4. If black captures the knight, f takes g6 follows, threatening mate on h7. If bishop takes g6 is played as a defensive try, a two-move checkmating sequence follows with rook to f8. After the rook is captured, the queen recaptures, delivering checkmate. I hope this idea is now clear and that we add it to our repertoire of attacking plans. Now, let's move on to the next lesson, where we will discuss the most common mistake players make when first learning chess. One that I hope we never commit again. What we are about to see is a very common mistake when we're starting out in chess, and even advanced players can fall into it. Allow me to explain with this instructive example. White begins with e4, and black responds with d5, the Scandinavian defense. The capture follows, and the queen recaptures. Then, the game continues with knight c3 attacking the queen, which moves to a5. The center is occupied with d4, and development continues with knight f6 and bishop c4. At this point, c6 must be played to ensure a safe retreat for the queen. However, let's first see what happens if black neglects this move, instead playing bishop f5. Then the bishop is developed to d2, indirectly attacking the queen. Still, there is time to play c6, securing an escape route. However, if this move is naively ignored and instead e6 is played, the queen gets trapped after knight d5, a strong move. Now, the queen has no safe squares except a4, attacking the bishop. But here, white immediately wins with a classic tactical pattern. Bishop b5 check, a decoy, forcing the queen to capture the bishop. And now, a deadly fork is delivered with knight c7, attacking both the queen and the king. These kinds of traps happen when the queen is developed too early in the game. For all these reasons, let's go back. Black played c6, preventing all these tactical ideas. White still develops the bishop to d2. Now the development can continue with bishop f5, or a more cautious approach, queen c7. However, at this point, the player with the black pieces falls victim to one of the 7 deadly sins, which also applies in chess: greed. Black plays queen b6, attacking both the d4 pawn and the b2 pawn, which are undefended. But this is a mistake we must avoid, because instead of focusing on piece development and king safety, Black is wasting time chasing pawns, something that often leads to disaster. White responds by developing the knight to f3, defending the d4 pawn, which, when considering central control, is more important than the b2 pawn. The queen captures on b2, officially winning a pawn. However, the rook attacks it by moving to b1, forcing it to retreat to a3, as there are no other squares available. The example continues with knight e5, attacking the f7 square. To defend this threat, e6 must be played, and now simply castling follows. Meanwhile, the king remains dangerously in the center, so Black tries to bring it to safety by developing their bishop to e7. White develops the rook to e1, aiming directly at the opposing king, which immediately castles to escape any potential danger. At this point, let's evaluate the position. White has successfully developed almost all of their pieces, while Black, on the other hand, has yet to develop their queen side. Now, let's analyze the queen's journey. Black captured a pawn, but to do so, the queen had to move to d5, a5, b6, b2, and a3. That's 5 queen moves, while White has used that time efficiently to complete their development. And why is it crucial to finish development first? Because whoever completes development first will seize the initiative, and the player with the initiative can attack. And that's exactly what's about to happen in this game. White continued with knight e4, a strong move with a dual purpose. First, to eliminate the main defender of the opposite castling position, the knight on f6. Second, to clear the third rank, allowing the rook to swing over and join the attack on the king side. At this point, knight d7 should probably be played, trying to keep a knight on f6 to help defend the castled king. However, instead of this, an exchange takes place on e4, after which the rook recaptures. There is still time to develop the knight to d7, either aiming to trade on e5 or repositioning it to f6 for defense. But the player with the black pieces starts feeling that their queen is too far from the kingside defense. Additionally, they anticipate the threat of rook b3 and therefore retreat their queen to d6. Now that there is no knight on f6, the queen moves to h5. Let's note that Black's queen has moved 6 times, while White's queen has moved only once, positioning itself very threateningly against the opposing king. At this point, knight d7 could still be played. However, overwhelmed by the attacking possibilities, Black completely collapses and plays b5, double question marks for this move. There is no time for such pawn moves. The king is surrounded by many enemies. White continues with rook b3, a great move, bringing yet another piece into the attack. If the bishop is captured, the rook immediately swings to h3, threatening mate on h7. After h6 to stop the threat, a devastating sacrifice follows with bishop takes h6. Once the bishop is captured, the castling position is shattered, and with so many pieces swarming around the king, there is simply no escape. Let's go back a bit. If instead of capturing the bishop, an attempt is made to attack the queen with g6, it simply moves to h6, followed by bringing the rook to h3 with decisive effect. If instead of g6, f5 is played, attacking the rook on e4, the rook still reaches h3, and we already know the effects are decisive. In the game, however, Black tried f6, hoping to capture the knight and escape through f7. But White, playing with surgical precision, responded with rook g4, a strong move. The idea is that once the knight is captured, the rook sacrifices on g7. The king is forced to capture, and now the other rook enters with check on g3. The king cannot escape to f7, and if it moves to f6, it is checkmated with queen to f3. This means the king must retreat to h8, but now its tragic fate is sealed with bishop to d3, threatening a checkmate on h7. A possible continuation to prolong the game a few more moves could be e4, bishop takes e4, rook f5, bishop takes rook, pawn takes bishop, and now queen e8 check. The only move for Black is blocking with bishop f8. Then, White plays bishop to f4, a strong move. Since the queen must continue defending the bishop, it moves to e7, but now a decisive check is delivered with bishop e5. Let's note that this king has died due to the irresponsibility of his queen, who wasted many tempo capturing a pawn, and the queenside was never developed. Now, let's move on to the next lesson, where we will study a game by Fabiano Caruana to learn an important attacking pattern that often appears in the Ruy Lopez and the Italian Opening. We are in the year 2007 in the city of Trieste, Italy. Fabiano Caruana starts the game with e4, and sitting across from him, playing with the black pieces, is the 15-year-old Croatian player Lara Stock, who replies with e5. The game quickly heads into a Ruy Lopez. After this, Black responds with knight to f6, the solid Berlin defense. At this point, the main line is to castle, leading to the famous Kramnik vs. Kasparov endgame from the year 2000, which is notoriously difficult to win. For this reason, Caruana prefers to play d3, keeping all the pieces on the board and adopting a setup similar to the Italian Opening. The Croatian player continues development by placing her bishop on c5, and the game continues with c3, following, as mentioned, the Italian Opening style, with the only difference being that the white bishop is on b5 instead of c4. Black castles, white does the same, development proceeds with d6, and we reach the instructive moment of the game when Caruana pins the knight on f6 with bishop g5. The powerful analysis engine Stockfish sees no immediate problem with this pin. In fact, this position is common among elite players since they know how to neutralize it. However, if we step down a few levels, the story changes. In this case, the pin becomes truly annoying as there is no clear way to break it, as we will see in this example. Notice that the knight, which could assist in defense from d7, has already developed to c6. For now, h6 is played, and the bishop maintains the pin by retreating to h4. If Black takes the risk with g5, we will see the consequences a few moves later. The then international master continues development with queen e7. And here is a hint. This queen will suffer throughout the entire game and, in the end, will die on this square. Caruana develops his knight to d2, The bishop advances to d7, and the rook moves to e1, freeing the f1 square for the knight. The bishop is attacked with a6, forcing it to retreat to a4. Then it withdraws to a7, and the knight completes its maneuver, arriving at f1. If the queen attempts to free itself from the pin by retreating to e8, white will capture the knight, doubling the pawns and weakening the position around the king. If instead, now or later, the queen tries to go to e6 to break free from the pin, the white bishop, still in play, would attack it from b3, forcing it to retreat back to e7. This last detail is important, and we will fully understand it by the end of the video. Since the queen cannot free itself from the pin by moving, black abandons this idea and continues development with rook to e8. In many cases, the knight is moved to g3, but it is also viable to place it on e3, as in this case, it threatens to go to d5 with a double attack on the queen on e7 and the knight on f6, which remains pinned. To counter this threat, black decides to give up the bishop by capturing on e3, after which the rook recaptures. Development continues with rook d8, but I am not entirely sure about this move, as it adds more pieces to the pin, increasing the pressure on the position. Caruana, on the other hand, does not seem to be in a hurry and plays h3. Meanwhile, black has already developed all the pieces, but without a clear middle game plan, they decide to wait with the passive move king h8. At the end of this example, I will show a fragment from a game by Magnus Carlsen, where we will see how he successfully broke this pin efficiently and without taking any risks. For now, the tense calm before the storm continues with rook e1. The king moves back to g8, and the bishop retreats to c2, getting ready for what is to come. Black can no longer afford to play passively. They need to find a way to break this eternal pin and finally decide to play g5. But this is a risky move that always weakens the king's position. Caruana had been waiting for this moment for a long time and does not hesitate to punish it with the powerful sacrifice knight takes g5. Double exclamation mark for this move. The knight is captured and the bishop recaptures. A piece has been sacrificed in exchange for two crucial pawns in the king's defense. Moreover, the pin has been re-established, and there seems to be no clear way for black to break free. The Croatian player feels uneasy and moves her king to h8, but the white queen keeps up the pressure on the pin by moving to f3. The king, forced to support the knight, returns to g7. Now Fabiano steps up the pressure, bringing more pieces into the attack with rook e3. The black rook moves to g8, trying to reinforce the defense. The queen moves to g3, creating a dangerous X-ray attack on the king and forcing it to retreat to f8. To further increase the pressure on the pin, the white rook moves to f3. At this moment, black's best option would be to return the material by sacrificing the rook on g5 to eliminate the troublesome bishop maintaining the pin. However, instead of doing so, they make a mistake by trying to hold the position with rook g6. White decides to open the center with d4, but this gives black another chance to eliminate the bishop. Nevertheless, their opponent wastes this final opportunity to save the game and instead moves the king back to g7. We would criticize the king's passive moves, but it's important to remember that playing against this annoying pin is extremely difficult, especially when you have Fabiano Caruana sitting across from you. The game continues with white sacrificing the rook on f6, a strong move. The Croatian player is forced to capture with the rook, keeping the relentless pin against the black pieces. Fabiano advances his pawn to d5, attacking the knight. The idea is that once the knight moves, which it desperately does to d4, the queen is left undefended. So instead of capturing the knight, Fabiano continues with bishop takes f6, delivering a double check. This forces the king to capture, followed by queen h4. Black stops suffering and resigns, as after moving the king, for example, to g7, the queen on e7 will be captured, leaving white with a decisive material advantage. And just as I told you at the beginning, the black queen died on this square. But now, the real question is, why was this pin so lethal? And what should we do in these situations? Well, let's ask Mr. Magnus Carlsen for some help and see what he can teach us. We are now in round 6 of the 2013 World Championship in Chennai, India. Carlsen, playing with the black pieces, places his rook on e8 before playing d6, allowing the bishop to retreat if necessary. Meanwhile, Vishy Anand, with the white pieces, must wait for black to close the pawn chain before moving the bishop to g5. So he continues his development with rook e1. The bishop is attacked with a6, so it retreats to a4. The attack continues with b5, and the bishop falls back further to b3. Now, black could play h6, preventing all these dangers. However, the subtleties of this move must also be understood, as in certain positions, it can also be a mistake. We will explain this in another video. For now, Magnus, without fear, plays d6, and Anand seizes the opportunity he was waiting for to bring the bishop to g5, once again creating a pin. But this time, Carlsen has everything under control. First, he attacks it with h6, and, as expected, the bishop retreats to h4. At this point, Stockfish and other grandmasters recommend playing g5. However, some players, including myself, dislike this move because it is too risky and leaves the king too exposed. That's why I recommend the plan that Carlsen is about to execute, which is much more solid and risk-free. Just as we learned in the Kasparov video, which I hope you've watched, the purpose of this bishop is to counter the bishop on b3. That is why Magnus develops it to e6. Vishy continues by moving his knight to d2. The bishops are exchanged, the pawn recaptures. Magnus could now break free from the pin by bringing the queen to e6, since, unlike in the previous game, the light-squared bishops have already been exchanged, and the queen can no longer be attacked. However, in this specific position, white could advance the pawn to d5 at some point, attacking both pieces. That is why Carlsen first retreats the knight to b8, with the idea that after white moves, he can reposition it on d7, supporting the knight on f6. Now, although Magnus has supported the knight, the maneuver is not yet complete. Anand continues with knight f1, black responds with queen e7, and the knight reaches e3, once again threatening to go to d5. However, this time, the then challenger for the World Championship has the move queen e6, since, as we mentioned earlier, the light-squared bishops have already been exchanged. And just like that, Carlsen has successfully freed himself from the pin without taking any risks. Later, he went on to win the game, but that's another story. Now, we will dive into a bit of opening theory, and for that, we are going to learn how to play the most lethal gambit for players rated under 2000. To objectively find out which gambit has the highest success rate at the sub-2000 level, we will set up this online game tool on Lichess, excluding high-rated players. After the moves e4, e5, we may encounter the king's gambit, the move f4, which has a success rate of 53%. After that, in this same position, we frequently encounter the Danish gambit, which arises when d4 is played, the pawn is captured, and then c3 follows. As we can see, it has a success rate of 55%. Next, we move on to the Scotch gambit, which arises with knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d4, and instead of recapturing the pawn, white develops bishop c4. This gambit has a success rate of 55%. In this same position, we find the Goring gambit, which is the move c3, and as we see, it has a success rate of 56%. To continue, we follow the Italian game by developing the bishop to c4. If black responds with bishop c5, then we get the Evans gambit with the pawn sacrifice on b4, which, as we see, has a success rate of 53%. In this same position, we can continue by castling. Then, after knight f6, the pawn is sacrificed with the aggressive move d4. This is the Duke's gambit, which has a success rate of 59%. Without a doubt, this is the most lethal gambit at the sub-2000 level. But now, why does this gambit have such high winning percentages? Well, this happens because the pawn is attacking both e5 and c5, which forces the second player to capture. In each possible capture, white has a trap that many players fall into. In this video, we will explore what those possible traps are and, in case you are the player with the black pieces, how to neutralize them. Get ready, because we are about to dive into an intricate theoretical maze that will blow your mind. First, we need to remember how to reach the Duke's gambit. After the Italian game is played and black responds with bishop c5, white castles. Then, after knight f6, the pawn is sacrificed with the aggressive move d4. Let's remember this position, as it will be the starting point of the analysis. Now, let's move on to trap number 1. If black decides to capture the pawn with the knight, this is a mistake because of knight takes e5, threatening the f7 square. After castling to defend, bishop e3 follows, and the piece on d4 is pinned by the undefended bishop on c5. The only square it can move to without losing the piece is e6, but after that, the defender is eliminated. If the bishop is captured, for example, with the f-pawn, white simply plays bishop takes c5, winning a piece. Well, d6 could be played here, creating a double attack, but it is met with bishop a3, and after capturing on e5, the rook on f8 comes under attack. The advantage would be an exchange up. So, since capturing the bishop on e6 is not beneficial, black may try bishop takes on e3. So far, nothing major has happened. Both sides have captured one piece from their opponent. But now, white plays and will trade two minor pieces for a rook, starting with bishop takes on f7. After the exchanges, the bishop on e3 is captured, and as a result, white ends up with an exchange advantage once again. For all these reasons, and going back to the main position, capturing on d4 with the knight is a mistake. Now, let's move on to trap number 2, which arises when black decides to capture, but with the pawn. In this case, the game transposes into the dangerous max Lange attack. The pawn advances to e5, attacking the knight, and moving the attacked knight is not the best option for black, as we are about to see. Retreating it to g8, delaying development, does not seem like a good idea. If instead it moves to h5, it loses immediately because it becomes undefended, and white will continue with knight g5, attacking it with the queen while simultaneously targeting the f7 square. If instead of h5 it moves to e4, this is also a mistake that loses quickly, because after queen e2, the knight is trapped as it has no escape squares. It cannot go to g5, f6, d6, or c5. It also cannot be defended with, for example, d5, because white would capture en passant, followed by winning the piece. So, if retreating to g8 doesn't seem like a good idea, it can't go to d5, and moving to h5 and e4 are mistakes. It remains to be seen if it goes to g4. In this case, white can continue with the interesting sacrifice of bishop takes on f7, as after the king captures, it follows with knight g5 check, which uncovers the queen's attack on the knight on g4. After the king moves, for example to g8, the sacrificed piece is recovered while the black king remains weakened. The powerful analysis engine Stockfish says this position is equal, but from a practical standpoint, white wins 61% of the time, This is because it is always difficult to play with a weak king. For example, if the pawn on e5 is captured, it follows with queen e4, and black should be very careful, because if they innocently play d6 to defend the knight, they lose immediately with queen d5 check, the only move being king f8, and now f4 wins, as it threatens to capture on e5 with discovered check, and the knight cannot move because it would be checkmate on f7. As we have seen, moving the knight is not the best option for black. Their best move is to counterattack in the center with the strong move d5. After that, we will move on to trap number 3. So, after the strong move d5, white can capture the knight on f6, black captures the bishop on c4, and now rook e1 check follows. Moving to f8 doesn't seem like a healthy option. Covering with e7 isn't possible due to the pawn, so the best response is bishop e6. Now, a trap that has claimed many victims is moving the knight to g5. Black must know how to neutralize this move, because, for example, if they play naturally and capture the pawn on f6, they lose immediately with knight takes on e6, as after recapturing, the bishop on c5 is hanging, and white wins a piece with queen h5, creating a double attack. This same tactical theme occurs if the pawn captures on f6 or if the queen moves to d7. To neutralize this move, black must know that out of all the possible moves at their disposal, only 2 are good, g6 or queen d5. In the case of the latter, the game continues with knight c3 attacking the queen. The knight cannot be captured due to the pin on the e-file. Therefore, the queen moves to f5, after which knight e4 follows and black castles long. In this case, the game remains equal because, unlike in other variations, the king is safe on the queen side. All of this we've just seen is a fragment of the theory of the max Lange attack, which occurs when black decides to capture on d4 with the pawn. Now, let's look at trap number 4, which is the master trap of the Duke's Gambit, occurring in the main variation when black decides to capture with the bishop. In this case, the knight captures this important bishop, the knight recaptures, and now white continues with the strong move bishop g5. This pin turns out to be quite uncomfortable for black, as there is no dark-squared bishop to break it. In this position, the best defense for black is to continue with the plan d6, queen e7, bishop to e6 or d7, followed by long castling, moving the king away from danger. Because, for example, if they decide to castle short, white develops a strong attack with f4, and in the case of d6, the pawns are exchanged and the rook enters decisively, putting pressure on the pin. The pawn structure of black's castling will be weakened, along with all the dangers that come with it. If instead of castling, black decides to first attack the bishop with h6, it maintains the pin with bishop h4. There is still time to aim for long castling with d6, queen e7, bishop d7, the plan we discussed earlier, because if they venture to play g5, that is the main idea in this position. The Duke's Gambit reveals all its venom with the spectacular advance of f4. Double exclamation marks for this move. The idea is to quickly open up the position of the black king, who is still in the center of the board. If the bishop on h4 is captured, white responds with f takes e5, simultaneously attacking the knight on f6. Now, let's move on to the next lesson, where we will study a game by Fabiano Caruana to learn an important attacking pattern that often appears in the Ruy Lopez and the Italian opening. Now, we will dive into a bit of opening theory, and for that, we are going to learn how to play the most lethal gambit for players rated under 2000. Now, it is time to talk about endgames. We will explore a fundamental concept in bishop endgames as we analyze one of the most incredible moves ever played. Now, to wrap up, we will close with a short calculation exercise that will get our brains working. I hope you enjoyed all these lessons and got the most out of them, as they were full of valuable insights. If you like them, leave me a comment. That way I'll know you're ready for a second class soon. E8 as the only option. After that, bishop h8 was played, and since the f-pawn is pinned, checkmate on g7 is unavoidable on the next move. Now it is time to talk about endgames. We will explore a fundamental concept in bishop endgames as we analyze one of the most incredible moves ever played. Let's break it down. Black has a two-pawn advantage, but the presence of opposite-colored bishops suggested that the most likely outcome would be a quick draw. And that was exactly what Nigel Short and Vishy Anand, who were commentating on the game, had concluded. After analyzing for a while, we agreed there was no way to win. But then the unthinkable happens. Alexei Shirov, playing with the black pieces, raises his hand and stuns everyone with bishop h3, a move that defies all logic. For many, this is the most surprising and incredible move in the entire history of chess. Nowadays, engines are incredibly powerful, but for a long time, even they struggled to find this move. And if you want to understand the concept behind this move, the answer is in this video. To fully grasp the idea behind Shirov's move, we first need to understand an important concept. For example, let's look at this endgame, where white has 3 pawns against a bishop. Obviously, white is the only one with winning chances. However, this position is a draw because of the crucial principle of everything on a single diagonal. From this position, the bishop can simultaneously control the advance of all white's pawns, as none of them can move forward without being captured. If the white king moves to b4, trying to support his pawns to push them forward, the black king arrives just in time at d6 to stop it. Likewise, if the white king moves to a5 aiming for b6, the black king reaches c7 and stops it again. And this will repeat over and over. There is simply no way to make progress. As we mentioned before, the bishop and king will defend this single diagonal perfectly. This important concept in bishop versus pawn endgames also applies to opposite-colored bishop endgames. For example, let's give white an extra bishop and place it on d5. Even with a 3-pawn advantage, this position is still completely drawn because the bishop, being on the opposite color, has no influence whatsoever on the blockade happening on the dark squares. For instance, we already know that white cannot make progress along this diagonal. In this case, the king might try to maneuver toward d3, looking for a way to sneak in from the right side of the board. But as soon as the king reaches e2, attempting to infiltrate through this route, black's king simply steps to f4, shutting the door once again. If the white king keeps trying by moving to f1, this time attempting to break through along this diagonal, the black king simply steps to g3, blocking the path once again. There is no way through. If the white king tries to go back, the black king mirrors its move, maintaining the blockade. This means the position is dead drawn. If we ask Stockfish, it confirms the evaluation, showing only a tiny symbolic advantage for white. But now, let's make a small change. Let's remove the bishop and move the pawn from c4 to f3. Now, everything has changed drastically. This endgame is completely lost for black, due to the fact that the game is no longer confined to this diagonal, because the advance of this pawn also needs to be addressed. No matter who moves, the position is easily winning. For example, white plays king to c4, black wastes a tempo with bishop a7, and now f4 is played, securing the win. If black's king captures the pawn, whether now or later, it will eventually have to take it. And once that happens, the white king enters d5, reaching the critical squares c6 and b7, which leads to an easy win in the endgame. If we ask Stockfish, it confirms the evaluation. This position is completely won for white. Therefore, we can conclude that in bishop versus pawns endgames, or even opposite-colored bishop endgames, the everything on a single diagonal concept is often more important than material itself. Now, let's take this idea and apply it to Shirov's game. First, as we mentioned earlier, black has a two-pawn advantage, and they are strong passed pawns, but there are opposite-colored bishops on the board. Let's try to win this position by playing normally. For example, let's go for what seems like the most natural move in the world, bishop e4. White continues with pawn to g3. Now, to move this pawn out of the bishop's attack, we push it to f5. White's king moves to f2, while black's king, needing to support the passed pawn's advance, aims to reach c5, so it moves to d6. Now, the king reaches the critical square e3, and black's king gets to c5 as planned. But if we take a closer look, the bishop, from this single diagonal, is completely stopping both the pawn advance and the promotion of the other pawn. Because of this, white can even afford to waste a tempo. The black king tries to enter the queen side, and white can afford to waste another tempo without any risk. Black plays king b3, aiming to enter c2, then move to b1 and support the promotion of the pawn. But white responds with king d2, shutting the door completely. Black then tries to enter from a2, but once again, white blocks the path with king c1. There is simply no way through. If the king goes back, white's king mirrors its moves, and there is no way to make progress. The same mechanism we saw earlier applies here once again. If we ask Stockfish, it confirms that despite the two-pawn advantage, this endgame is a draw. The reason? The everything on a single diagonal principle holds perfectly. Let's go back to the main position and try something different. This time, let's go for a more creative attacking approach. This time, we go for a direct approach, playing king d6, willingly sacrificing the f6 pawn. But as we have learned, capturing material is not the priority. Instead, white plays king f2, ensuring that when black's king reaches c5, white can immediately respond with the critical move king e3. This completely stops the advance of the d pawn, while still maintaining the entire defensive setup along a single diagonal. Once again, this position is completely drawn. There is no way to break this fortress on the dark squares, just as we saw in the previous examples. Now let's return to the starting position, and suddenly, Shirov's move, bishop h3, becomes much easier to understand. 2 exclamation marks for this move. Although this move required incredible precision and calculation, Shirov had a clear understanding of the concept and knew exactly what needed to be done to win the endgame. The idea behind this move is that black's king will quickly reach e4, push the d-pawn forward to d4, and break white's defensive setup on the diagonal, without giving the king time to stop it, as we will see next. For example, Topalov, after witnessing this stunning move, naturally captured the bishop. But to deepen our understanding, let's explore what would have happened if he had not captured and instead played king f2. In this case, black's king advances to f5. If it reaches e4, the game is completely winning, so white tries to stop it with king f3. But after this, black plays bishop takes g2, check. If white captures the bishop, the king reaches e4, and as we already know, this position is winning. If white avoids capturing the bishop and instead plays king e3 to block king e4, the position is still lost, because now the f-pawn has become a passed pawn as well. And although the king and bishop can temporarily hold back both pawns using the single diagonal defense we studied earlier, at some point, the f-pawn will push forward, breaking the fortress, exactly like we saw in the introductory example. So, Topalov is not going to leave this astonishing move unanswered. Of course, he captures the bishop. After this, Shirov continues with king f5. White plays king f2, but black's king reaches e4, and now there is no way to stop the d-pawn from advancing to d4 on the next move. Seeing this, Topalov at least decides to capture the f6 pawn. But as we mentioned earlier, the d-pawn pushes forward to d4, and white is now completely lost. Why? Because the single diagonal defense has been shattered. White might still manage to block the d-pawn on one diagonal, but there is no way to control both diagonals at the same time, which means the a-pawn will eventually break and decide the game. For example, black is now threatening to push the a-pawn to a3, after which there would be no way to stop it. This forces white to play bishop e7 to prevent it. Now, if the king were on e2, directly opposing black's king and preventing it from entering, the game would likely be a draw. But white is one tempo behind, and as Tartakower famously said, chess is the tragedy of a single tempo. Black's king now enters d3, with the simple plan of reaching c2 and supporting the pawn's promotion. To try to prevent this, the bishop threatens the pawn on c5, but the king moves to c4, countering the attack. Since white's bishop must stay on this diagonal, it moves back to e7. Now, black's king moves to b3, with the simple idea of reaching c2 once again. White's bishop attacks the c5 pawn again, but this time, black pushes the d-pawn to d3, threatening to continue with d2. The bishop must stay on this diagonal, so the only way to stop it is with the king, either from e1 or e3, but it does not matter, because in both cases the king reaches c2. After this, there is no way to stop d2, so white's bishop must move to b4. But now, the other pawn pushes forward, a3. And this is the key concept of the video. The bishop cannot control both diagonals at the same time. White has no choice but to play bishop takes a3, but now black simply plays d2, and there is nothing white can do to stop the pawn from queening. This is why Topalov decided to resign. Now, to wrap up, we will close with a short calculation exercise that will get our brains working. Chess is all about problem solving, and we must learn to tackle these problems by thinking logically. In this position, white faces a survival problem. Black is close to promoting, the king is coming to support the pawn, and unless an effective solution is found, an agonizing defeat will be inevitable. The exercise is not too difficult, so if you feel confident, you can challenge yourself and try to solve it all on your own. But if you find it challenging, let me guide you through a step-by-step analysis so we can discover the brilliant saving move together. You are playing with the white pieces. First, choose 2 or 3 candidate moves, those that seem most appealing to you. Analyze them briefly and then decide on one. There is no need to calculate everything until the very end. Just focus on selecting the moves that stand out to you in this position. You can pause the video now to think about it and then continue once you are ready. I hope you took the time to pause and have chosen your move. If, for example, the primitive idea of playing rook b1 came to mind to attack the pawn and potentially capture it, this move fails because black will simply defend the pawn with king a3. At the same time, the king is getting closer to the critical a2 square to support the pawn's promotion and secure the win. As a result of this plan, the rook ends up in a very passive position. A fundamental concept in rook endgames is that the rook must always remain active. The best way to achieve this is by operating from a long distance, exerting maximum control over the board. From this cramped position, with almost no squares to move to, this will not be possible. So we must discard this passive idea. The correct idea, as we discussed earlier, is to activate the rook from a long distance, placing it behind the pawn, for example, with rook d8. This idea is brilliant. Let's break it down. The rook is tied down to the defense of the pawn, so moving it would not make much sense. If black boldly tries to promote, it turns out to be a mistake. Why? Exactly. White delivers a check on a8. The king has no other squares to move to except b5. Then another check follows on b8, and on the next move, the queen is captured. The result? A completely drawn endgame. In this way, white successfully prevents black from promoting to a queen. If instead, the king tries to advance a3, aiming to reach a2 and support the pawn, things turn out even worse. It immediately gets checkmated with rook a8. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the huge difference we achieved simply by activating the rook. However, despite the correctness of the idea, this move turns out to be a mistake that actually loses the game. The question is, how does white lose? This is your moment to think. Pause the video and try to figure out why this move is a mistake. If you pause the video, I hope you were able to find the answer. White loses because black can promote to a knight, delivering check, a brilliant move. If the king moves to either of the two available squares, the rook delivers check from d2, supported by the newly promoted knight. On the next move, black captures the rook, securing the win. Therefore, the only move for the king is to c4. Now, black continues with rook c2, delivering check. The king has no real options and must move back to one of the three available squares, for example, king d5. Then, black delivers another check with rook d2, followed by capturing the rook, securing the victory. For all these reasons, the move rook d8 loses the game. So, let's go back to the original position. We have already examined rook b1 and the seemingly logical rook d8, but neither move was enough to force a draw. However, we are getting closer to finding the correct move. Now, pause the video again and try to come up with a new move. If you pause the video and now thought of playing rook d6 with the idea that if black promotes to a knight, white can respond with king c4, followed by rook c2 check, then king d5, now, unlike the previous variation, the rook on d6 is defended. Unfortunately, this idea fails because black simply returns to the original plan. Instead of promoting to a knight, they promote to a queen. After rook a6, the king moves to b5, and now it is no longer possible to deliver a check along the b file because the rook is too close to the king. As a result, white loses once again, and this idea with rook d6 also fails. Recap. First, we lost because the rook became passive on b1. Then, we lost because the rook was too far from the king on d8. Finally, we lost because the rook was too close on d6. Through this logical process of elimination, we have now arrived at the correct move in the position, rook d7. 2 exclamation marks for this brilliant move. Out of the 18 available moves in the initial position, only this one secures a draw. Now, let's see the difference. If black does nothing active, then rook b7 follows, capturing the pawn and achieving a draw. Additionally, we already know that the king cannot go to a3, because this time it would be immediate checkmate with rook a7. If instead, black decides to promote to a queen, we already know the plan. Check on a7, the king moves to b5, and now the rook is at the perfect distance to deliver another check on b7, saving the game. If black promotes to a knight, the critical variation, then the white king moves to c4. Black delivers check on c2, The king moves to d5, and after rook to d2, this time, white's king is at the perfect distance to save the game with king e6, keeping the rook defended. The correct idea at the perfect distance to force a draw. I hope you enjoyed all these lessons and got the most out of them, as they were full of valuable insights. If you like them, leave me a comment. That way I'll know you're ready for a second class soon.